Hello, I'm David, inventor of the doped carbon-60 nanoparticle pump. This device arcs highward spun exotic matter directly into the third ventricle of the brain to enhance intuition and ESP, much like the Lord Yahweh in the Holy Bible enhanced the Israelites as an invincible army to invade Canaan. Also, you might recall from Sunday school how David, when fleeing the mentally ill King Saul, went straight to the temple and acquired the showbread from the high priest to feed to his small band of soldiers, with Saul so enraged he killed the priests, every one of them. We will examine compelling evidence that these accounts in the Bible are very true when one understands that the true nature of the transition platinum group metals is fine white powder. I could call this an introductory video because it may serve as an outline for so many extraordinary new interpretations of the Bible story. I might produce more videos on this one as an attention grabber. Therefore, I will show you twice, my evidentiary point being the sulfur burns in the ancient Fertile Crescent. These furnace burns were how the Bible characters redacted sulfur into sulfuric acid to use in lead-copper batteries for the electrolysis to redact metal gold into highward spin exotic matter, monatomic gold, or manna. Count with me 5 large patches of scorched rock, first in Arabia at Mount Sinai, then at Hathor Temple, or Mount Serabit in the northern limestone shelf of the Sinai Peninsula. Then recall how Moses took the golden calf up Mount Sinai and somehow reduced it to white powder, then was able to mix this white powder into water and give it to the Israelites, camped below, to drink. Monatomic gold indeed enhances the conductivity of DNA in the cerebrospinal fluid so to improve communications between the pineal and pituitary glands, as well as balancing the brain waves between the hemispheres of the brain. First, I want to introduce you to Sir Lawrence Gardner, and you might want to search out some of his video lectures for yourself.
Are you? He says, I am that I am. I am the one that Abraham used to call El Shaddai. What he's really saying is, you're talking to Jethro, the Lord of the Mountain. El Shaddai is recorded in Mesopotamian texts, Lord of the Mountain, as being the ultimate leader of the Vulcans. The Vulcans were the master craftsmen, and the Vulcans made the manna at the furnaces. So there's a big link here between this guy. You know, Jethro is so important to this, as the Lord of the Mountain, as the man in charge of this temple. But he has to be left out, because if we realize that the person giving out these laws and ordinances on the mountain was simply Jethro, the Lord of the Mountain, the whole of Moses and Jehovah story disappears. Doesn't exist in the way that we're told it at all. There is no mention in the whole of the book of Jasher, in that sequence, of Jehovah. Only mentioned is Jethro.
The correct interpretation of the Bible reveals that the extraordinary parable imagery about a Garden of Eden, an apple offered by a talking serpent, and the massive flood with destruction of a tower of Babylon are all actual events. The Elohim peppered throughout the Hebrew text speak of the Anunnaki ruling class, and among these were genetically bred giant geniuses, the Nephilim. 6-carboxytetrahydropterin is a skeleton-building growth hormone found in the pituitary gland and was used to grow an infant's skeleton, and with a special head brace would enlarge the brain capacity. Additionally, viable human fetal stem cells in menstruum applied directly through the olfactory fibers into the frontal lobes provides for telomere regenesis, a rebuilding of healthy young cells throughout the entire body, the fountain of youth. The idea is taboo and revolting according to the Bible, which is intended that way by one Anunnaki giant and Nephilim Enlil Yahweh. The Bible story is remarkably accurate once the parables are decrypted correctly. By enhancing superconductive communications in the cerebrospinal fluid and, speaking for myself, being confluence between two dynastic bloodlines out of ancient Sumer, I am able to read the DNA memories and interpret them into conscious thought. Here, this is me sharing the evidence my memories are correct to the historical record. Herein lies an explanation why the Egyptian slaves building pyramids and cities would never revolt, and how they cut such wonderfully perfect stones and would transport them into place with such precision, all without leaving behind one single threaded metal nut and bolt. The highward spin exotic matter is capable of interdimensional charge compression that can create and annihilate gravity, and also it can cut and drill through solid rock. This technology is mentally driven, or like the Bible says, it depends on faith. One might recall that Solomon's workforce, building the temple in Jerusalem, cut the stones without making any hammer or chisel noise at all. The intention of Enki, Enlil's half-brother, was to share the manna with humanity, not just for pyramid building, but for self-governance and home rule worldwide. Enki was indeed the dragon of the Bible, vilified as a serpent in the Garden of Eden, Cain's biological father through Eve. Enlil became the jealous god of the Holy Bible and was fearsome indeed, as the record shows, beginning in the book of Genesis and in the garden at a place called Eden. David Hudson, a farmer in Arizona, extracted this strange white powder from the soil and noticed some very strange things. He wrote his observations and presented them to a still unbelieving world. So I'm not trying to convince you other than to imagine using a direct current voltage and jeweler's stock silver to produce a very strong colloidal silver solution. Now set it on the windowsill until the water dries off in the sun. You will have a powder residue of that silver. Scrape it together and put it into a crucible, and note that it is no longer silver metal. If you heat it up, it will not melt together into metal. When you heat it to nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it reaches the boiling point for silver metal, and it will flash a bright white flash and disappear. These are the kinds of experiments David Hudson and scientists were doing. They noted if they weighed the powder and heated it up, it would become heavier, and while it cooled, it would become lighter, even weightless. More than weightless, as the tray it touched would also become weightless and register less than weightless on the scale. I'm laying a foundation for another observation that you can easily duplicate by launching Google Earth on your browser. The Sumerian record explains what was going on in the book of Genesis. The Eden was a fertile plain and a productive agricultural and ranching project consisting of a large dammed reservoir feeding 4 streams for irrigation. Mesopotamia and the entire Fertile Crescent held several shining cities with mystery schools we might compare to our modern-day universities. The Anunnaki ruled over these cultural centers wisely and in coordinated cooperation with enhanced mental communications of Manna in their cerebrospinal fluid. The gigantism and genetically engineered genius was extremely dangerous, with a very high attrition rate to raise these Nephilim leaders from infancy to mature adult. Additionally, to produce these characteristics among themselves required the incest of mitochondrial DNA. Brother and sister would often be required to issue children for this line. We know now, and they knew it back then, that this means the bloodline was due to failure because of recombinant DNA-bred disease. When Anu announced his retirement as president, Enlil assumed the presidency as the older brother over Enki. Enki protested, as his mother was the more pure Nephilim queen of the Anunnaki. Of the 2 Bible characters, Enki was giant, but had normal skull capacity by proportion. His head was shaped like a normal man according to his body size. Marduk, another Anunnaki ruler, settled the dispute by popular vote of the people and became the president. Enlil was outraged in being a genius-bred psychopath brought about destruction of a beautiful civilization. The book of Genesis describes it well when you lose the Sunday school interpretation. The apple is manna, and the cerebrospinal fluid enhanced intuition and ESP. This is wisdom and enlightenment. Anki intended the manna reserves at Hathor Temple for all humanity, in anticipation that the days of the Anunnaki rulers and bloodline were numbered by the incest-driven attrition to the genetic integrity. The world's most ancient sovereign court and mystery school is called the Imperial Court of the Dragon's Sovereignty. Its coat of arms are found in the Bible as the Mark of Cain. Its mission statement is to preserve the scientific integrity of the Anunnaki bloodline. It makes no sense that Cain would be rewarded with protection by the Mark after killing Abel. The correct interpretation is that Cain was of a much purer rulership bloodline than Abel, and this leads us into the correct sexual unions of Eve. Cain is in fact the root for the word king. There are two fathers and one non-Anunnaki mother. This is where we find the Enoch story fits the actual historical record. The Anunnaki Nephilim father, a son of God, the angel, coupled with a daughter of man. Cain is Anunnaki, and Abel was of a lesser bloodline, blood of the soil, by comparison to Cain's royal blood. Cain spilling Abel's blood to the soil is a misinterpretation. Enlil Yehoah was so upset about losing the presidency to Marduk, he invited hordes of surrounding barbarians to raid and conquer Sodom, Gomorrah, and other wealthy libraries of culture depicted as terrible, sin-filled dens of debauchery in the Bible. These two cities became famous because they utilized such a high content of sulfur in the bricks that these cities could actually burn in the high desert summer. Fire and brimstone. Sulfur plays a big role in this whole interpretation about enhancing the listening power of the third eye, tuning in correct intermediate frequencies and harmonics to consciously comprehend divine orchestrations. Enlil's encouragement to invaders is the Tower of Babylon parable, resulting in confusion of tongues, what drove Abram to Ur in Chaldea to flee with his half-sister Sarai. At 91 and 99, Sarai and Abram are fleeing Ur for their lives. These invading bands of barbaric Hittites and Jebusites are quite ruthless. Abram and Sarai encounter Anunnaki by the title Melchizedek and contract for some developmental and genetic engineering. Sarai receives a refreshed womb through telomere regenesis and gives birth to Isaac. She is rewarded with 35 more years of life, and Abram receives 77 years of productive life. Their names change to Abraham and Sarah. A simple reading and knowing of recombinant DNA tells us that Abraham sent Sarah to Pharaoh's bed. It makes no sense that the story is how a craven Abraham let his wife half-sister Sarah sleep around because this 91-year-old woman was such a fox he feared for his life. What makes sense is that in the wisdom of the Anunnaki and dragon court Sarah, the Chaldean was bred with Senusret III of Egypt to produce a new strain, the Israelites. The bloodline that Abraham is the patriarch of is the Arab nations through Hagar and their son Ishmael. It even shows in Scripture how Senusret II verified the pregnancy as Abimelech, which means father of the king. Abimelech took Sarah to bed and is on the record saying he found her already pregnant. This changes everything. I'm only delivering a quick summary of the correct interpretation of the Holy Bible. I mentioned David, the genetic engineering developing into a later Messiah, Jesus the Nazarene. Note how Samuel was enhanced with mysticomimetic neuropsychopharmacology from the temple incense and showbread that contained manna. Samuel was raised from a toddler by the high priest Eli. Living inside the temple, Samuel selected David while David's family tried to hide him from Samuel. Samuel was equipped with a divining tool called the Urim and Thummim to read DNA. David fled mentally ill Saul and went straight to the temple in Shiloh to feed showbread to his soldiers, and in alignment with this interpretation that enables his bandits, called Abiru, with intuition and ESP. Soon the people chanted, "Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands." Interestingly, the first commission David accepted as mercenary soldiers was with enemy of the state, the Philistines. The Aburu are my important point. Aburu were bandits. During the invasion of foreigners into the once wealthy Babylon Gardens and the Eden, a class of mercenary soldiers developed, and when they were unemployed, they became bandits. Jethro, was the governor of Midian during Moses' lifetime. Midian was located in today's Saudi Arabia, and Jethro lived in today's Al-Dad. There was sulfur to be mined in the nearby mountains, and Jethro was chieftain of the Vulcans, an artificer or alchemist who was changing gold into manna. Moses was Egyptian, as pointed out, with Abraham and Sarah being wed to Senusret III, with Moses being Amenhotep IV, and with the famous discussion about set my people free being between Moses and his father Amenhotep III. The discussion is a parable for the strategy to get a large amount of gold to Jethro, for him to convert into manna and treat the Israelites with the SP and the intuition necessary to conquer the invading peoples of Canaan. Among these were some of the remaining Nephilim, who had been able to keep limited power in the area now called Israel. Now we see the purpose of the parable about David and Goliath. The giant Nephilim were contracted for extinction. This is where the following story gets interesting on Google Earth. First, however, it helps to understand that during the time of David becoming into cainship or kingship as a son of God, the Nephilim were becoming extinct. This is the parable about the battle of David and Goliath. Even as a real historical event, slaying a giant with a sling after he has spent his 2 spears would not be a very challenging fight for David. Google Earth reveals the topography of the Near East, and here, Temple Luxor in northern Africa, including Saudi Arabia. Then Midian, where Jethro also burned sulfur to create black vitriol, sulfuric acid for the Baghdad batteries used to reduce gold into monatomic fine white powder. From the Nile, we go to Hathor Temple on the Sinai Peninsula. So we know the first stop of the Bible's Exodus was never Sinai, because that has always been part of Egypt. And if the Israelites escaped to the Sinai Peninsula, they would not have escaped Pharaoh. The Hathor Temple on the northern mountains of the Sinai Peninsula was used for thousands of years to create mutzkets, Shemana or manna in the Bible terms. When Flinders Petrie was commissioned to explore the Serbet archaeological site in 1904, he discovered tons of fine white powder and assumed it was wood ash. Never mind the idiocy of that presumption among rock, desert, and mountains with no wood to burn. Petrie uncovered the remaining manna and let it be destroyed to the wind and occasional rain. Here called Allah's, the mountain of the law, or Horeb, known as Sinai in Arabia in the Bible. The findings of fact presented here reveal that there are at least 3 gods conversing directly with Bible characters: Enlil, his half-brother Anki, and Jethro, the governor of Midian, here called Allah's, the mountain of the law, or Horeb, known as Sinai in Arabia in the Bible. This is the first manna production facility, worked for a millennium, and doubles as a library of the many dynasties of the entire Fertile Crescent. Hathor, the original mother goddess, is depicted throughout the recorded rulers, and so this Serbet temple is correctly called Hathor Temple. You are encouraged to explore this tour on your own Google Earth app, because I am focusing on the size of the sulfur burn to the northwest of the temple, showing clearly the prevailing winds here from the southeast. There is a smaller burn to the south for when the winds shifted. The modern solution would be the smokestack, of course. By the nearly complete lack of and poor quality of turquoise in Egyptian jewelry, these findings describe the mining in the area was for sulfur, not turquoise. Leaving the Sinai Peninsula, we follow the Exodus to Saudi Arabia, where the Israelites camped, being prepared for the invasion of Canaan. The mountain is called Allah's, the mountain of law, and Moses indeed received the tables of destiny from Lord Jethro, the governor of Midian, who would not give Moses his name other than I am that I am. I prefer the less confusing Bible title, Mount Horeb. The mountaintop is too rugged for any manna production, so the facility on the high plain to the north of Mount Horeb, where what looks like a government intelligence communications operation is staged these days. There's a large sulfur burn at the edge of the working area. When the Israelites were summoned out of Egypt with the gold Joseph extorted by insider information, years of about 7 feast and 7 years of famine, Jethro staged a theatrical burn site we read about in the Bible's book of Exodus. This sulfur burn is on the steep ridge directly between the summit of Horeb and the valley below, where the Israelites camped and built altars. Biblical archaeologist Robert Cornicky climbed to this burn and photographed what would otherwise be a geological anomaly, heat-scorched granite. Going to the northern end of the valley below the Israelite encampment, we find another burn a ways up the steep hillside to avoid breathing deadly sulfur fumes. Remember that the purpose of burning all this sulfur is to produce black vitriol, sulfuric acid for creating 2-volt batteries composed of copper and lead. The electricity redacts gold to its pure monatomic form, nanoparticulate single atoms of gold without gluons, holding it in powder form. A futuristic physics lesson tells us that these transition metals from the asteroid belt are boiled meteorites that can be encased single-atom highward spin exotic matter, starfire, encased inside buckyball fullerenes. This carbon-60 was discovered as a third allotrope of carbon in 1985. Research its medical applications on your own, please. We are carbon-based life forms, and one buckyball fits perfectly inside the inner groove of one twist of the DNA's double helix. The Beatty study on carbon-60 shows how even a short dosage doubles the lifespan of lab rats. Telomere regenesis. Enough about me and my recent invention, the doped carbon-60 nanoparticle pump. In the bottom of the valley, we find an archaeological site titled Altar of Moses. Google Earth is a tremendous research tool, and we can get some perspective about the theatrical burn and line it up with our Bible studies. See how the summit of Horeb lines up with the theatrical burn on the steep ridge, and then the valley below where the Israelites camped. This describes exactly what we read about in the Bible's book of Exodus, a smoking mountain. There are some amazing remains that fit well with the Bible's story when you enable Street View and click on the blue dots. I'm focusing on the sulfur burns here. There's a convincing remain where the Israelites celebrated the famous golden calf idolatry that accumulated the gold for seizure in a classical religious guilt trip. Here's another Cornicky photo where some claim there are remains of 12 large altars. It is seriously off limits. To review the burns and refresh the new Bible geography, we return to the Hathor Temple in the northern mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. This will give you a feel of the broader geography. Here I am showing the valley where the Israelites camped below Horeb in Arabia. Thanks to Google Earth and photographers who have explored and contributed, we can see all the popular relics from this vantage point: the summit of Horeb, the theatrical burn, the altar of Moses, the sulfur burn in the valley, the altars of the Israelites, the golden calf altar, and the Manna fabrication plant. The fabrication plant is of immediate interest. It has a bend in it like the Hathor Temple, and by Petrie's description of this, may mark a distinction between the electrolysis redaction of the gold and finishing and storage of the manna. This is a very convincing golden calf altar down in the valley. One prominent landmark would be a water source for the Israelites, and by the sheer numbers for such a large army, the encampment also extended up to the north. The following is some fairly convincing evidence that the manna, within the context of knowledge and wisdom of a nearly forgotten technology, can cut, drill, and transport solid rock. Exotic matter, by nature, already exhibits the ability to completely disassemble platinum group metals, to degrade our hardest and heaviest metals into nanoparticulate dust. There is very convincing evidence of a pipe downward through hundreds of feet of solid rock in order to reach the aquifer. This kind of erosion describes a profuse flow of water over a very long period of time. Nearby, in Al-Bad, where Jethro, the high Vulcan and governor of Midian, lived, we find an archaeological find called Well of Moses. There is a modern pool nearby within the fencing. I bring your attention to the drilling technology used, drilling down through solid rock.